The wind came down off the Bitterroot Mountains like a living thing that January of 1887, and it was that wind, howling through the broken gate of the Wells homestead, that carried the sound of a woman's cry to Daniel Wells just as he was about to give up on the day and go inside. He stood at the edge of his cleared land, an axe still in his hand, snow up past his boot tops, and for a moment he thought the wind itself was playing tricks on him, the way it sometimes did up in those high valleys of the Montana Territory, whistling through canyons until a man swore he heard voices in it. But then the sound came again, thinner this time, more like a whimper than a cry, and Daniel Wells was already moving before he had decided to move at all. He was a big man, the kind the mountains seemed to produce on purpose, with shoulders that filled a doorway and forearms roped with muscle from 10 years of splitting wood and swinging a smith's hammer. His dark hair had grown long since the fall, past his collar now, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, more out of practicality against the cold than any vanity. He had lived alone on this stretch of land at the base of the mountain since he was 19 years old, and in all that time he had never heard a woman's voice out here. Not once. Not in the deep winter when the passes closed, and the nearest town of Bannock's Ridge might as well have been on the other side of the earth. He followed the sound past the barn, past the linta where his horse Samson stood stamping uneasily, out toward the old fence line that marked the edge of his property, where a gate hung broken on one hinge, half buried in a drift that had built up against it for 3 days straight. And there, slumped against the gate-post with her skirts frozen stiff around her legs and her bonnet knocked half off her head, was a woman. For one terrible moment Daniel thought she was dead. Her face had gone the color of the snow around her lips a shade of blue that no living person's lips should be, and her eyes were closed, her whole body curled in on itself the way a person curls when the cold has taken everything else and left only the instinct to hold on to what little warmth remains. But then her chest rose, just barely, a shallow breath that fogged in the freezing air, and Daniel dropped to his knees beside her without another thought. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, from days of talking to no one but his horse and his tools. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, dark lashes crusted with frost, and for a moment she looked at him or looked through him, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Then her lips moved and the words came out so faint he had to lean close to catch them. "The gate," she whispered. "It would not open. I tried so long." "Never you mind the gate now," Daniel said, and he was already sliding his arms beneath her, gathering her against his chest the way he might gather an armful of firewood, except she weighed less than firewood, less than she ought to, a slight woman made lighter still by cold and hunger, and however many hours she had spent fighting a gate that had rusted shut 2 winters past and that he had never gotten around to fixing. He carried her back toward the cabin, his boots punching through the snow with long, urgent strides, and he found himself talking to her the whole way, not because he expected her to answer but because some instinct told him she needed to hear a voice, needed something to hold on to besides the cold. "You are almost there," he said. "Just a little further now. I have got a fire going inside, going to have you warm again before you know it. You hang on now, you hear me? You hang on." Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt a fresh stab of fear at how still she had gone. But when he glanced down, he saw her eyes were still open, just barely, fixed on some point past his shoulder, and her breath was still coming, shallow and quick. He kicked open the cabin door and the warmth inside hit him like a wall after the brutal cold outside, and he carried her straight to the hearth where a fire crackled low, banked for the evening but still throwing good heat. He laid her down on the braided rug before it, as gently as he could manage, and then his hands went to work with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life doing hard things fast. He stripped off her sodden outer coat first, an old wool thing worn thin at the elbows, and then he saw the leather satchel strapped across her body, heavy with tools that clinked together as he moved it aside, and he wondered for a moment what manner of woman traveled these mountains with a satchel full of iron. But that thought could wait. Right now there was only the cold and the fight to push it back out of her. "I am going to take your boots off," he told her, though he was not sure she could hear him anymore. "Your feet need to breathe, need the air on them, or you will lose your toes to frostbite." Her boots were laced tight and frozen through, and it took him some effort to work them loose, and when he finally pulled them free, he saw her stockinged feet were nearly as pale as the snow outside, and he swore under his breath and began rubbing them between his big hands, working warmth back into her flesh the way his own father had taught him to do for a man who had gone through the ice on a frozen creek years ago. "Come on now," he muttered. "Come on back to me." She stirred, a small sound escaping her, and her eyes opened wider this time, focusing on him with something closer to awareness. "Who?" she started, but her teeth were chattering too hard for her to finish the word. "Name is Daniel Wells," he said. "This is my land you were near froze to death on. Do not you worry about talking right now. Just breathe. Just let the fire do its work." He fetched every blanket he owned from the trunk at the foot of his bed and piled them over her, and then, because the blankets alone did not seem to be enough, because she was still shivering so hard her whole body shook with it, he did the only other thing he knew to do. He built the fire up higher, fed it good split logs until it roared, and then he moved her, blankets and all, closer to the hearth, close enough that the heat pressed against her skin like a living hand. "I need to see your hands," he said, and when she did not respond, he gently worked her fingers free of the blanket and looked at them by the firelight. Her hands were rough for a woman's hands, calloused across the palm in a way that spoke of real work, and they were cold as stone, the fingers stiff and unresponsive when he tried to bend them. He took them between his own two hands, which dwarfed hers entirely, and began to rub warmth back into them the same as he had done her feet, breathing on them between rubs, holding them close to his chest where his own body heat could reach them. "That is it," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "That is it, come on now." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, color began to return to her fingertips, and her shivering, which had been violent and constant, began to ease into something less frantic, more like ordinary shuddering than the deep bone-cold shaking of near hypothermia. Daniel did not let go of her hands, not for a long while, sitting there on the floor beside her with the fire blazing and the wind still howling outside the cabin walls, and he watched her face as the tension in it slowly relaxed, as her breathing evened out, and he found himself studying features he had not had the chance to notice before. She had a strong jaw for a woman, and a nose with a slight bump in it as though it had been broken once and healed a little crooked, and even half frozen there was something striking about her, something that held his attention in a way he was not prepared for. "Where did you come from?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer, but she surprised him by speaking, her voice still weak but clearer now. "Bannock's Ridge," she said. "I was headed to the Callaway place. Was supposed to fix their strongbox before the bank examiner came through. Got caught in the storm on the pass. Lost the trail." She paused, swallowing hard. "Saw your fence line. Thought if I could just get through the gate I would find a house, find help. It would not budge. I pulled at it until my hands went numb, and then I could not remember why I was pulling at all." "You are a locksmith," Daniel said, understanding now the tools in her satchel. "Louisa Thatcher," she said, and even in her weakened state there was a note of pride in the way she said it, a woman announcing her trade. "I run the smith shop in town. Locks mostly. Some general ironwork when the need arises." She tried to shift to sit up and immediately winced, her whole body still stiff and aching from the cold. "How far am I from town?" "Near on 8 miles, Daniel said, "and the pass will not be crossable again until this storm breaks, could be 2 days, could be 4. You are not going anywhere tonight, Miss Thatcher. Not tomorrow either, most likely." She stared at him, and he watched calculation move behind her eyes, a woman weighing her circumstances the way he imagined she weighed the mechanisms of the locks she worked on, searching for the give, the weak point, the way through. But there was no way through a mountain storm, and after a moment she seemed to accept this, her shoulders sagging with something that might have been relief as much as exhaustion. "Then I suppose I owe you my thanks," she said. "And likely my life." "You do not owe me anything," Daniel said, and he meant it plainly without any expectation behind the words. "Anybody would have done the same, finding a person like I found you." "Not everybody," she said, and there was a weight behind those two words that told him she had reason to believe it, some history he did not yet know, but he did not press her on it. Instead he rose, careful not to jostle her, and went to the small kitchen area of his one-room cabin, where he set a pot of water to heat over the second, smaller fire he kept for cooking. "I am going to make you something warm to drink," he said. "Coffee first, get your blood moving, and then I will see about some broth. You need to eat something once you are steady enough." "You do not need to trouble yourself," Louisa said, though her voice lacked conviction, and Daniel almost smiled at the stubbornness in her even now, half frozen and wrapped in a stranger's blankets, still trying to protest that she was not worth the trouble. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to look at her, "you near died on my land tonight. I would trouble myself a good deal more than a pot of coffee to make sure that did not happen. Now you rest there, and let me do what needs doing." She did not argue further, and Daniel took that as evidence of just how spent she truly was. He busied himself with the coffee, glancing over at her every few moments to be sure she was still breathing steady, still holding her own against the cold. And by the time the pot was ready, she had drifted into something between sleep and unconsciousness, her breathing slow, and even now, her color much improved from the ghastly white it had been when he found her. He let her sleep, moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire again to keep it steady through the night, checking the door and the shutters to be sure the wind could not find its way in. And as he worked, he found his eyes drawn back to her again and again, this stranger who had appeared out of the storm like something conjured, this woman with tool-roughened hands and a proud way of speaking even at death's door. And he wondered, not for the first time in his solitary life, what it might be like to have someone else's presence filling up the empty corners of his cabin permanently instead of just for the length of a storm. He shook the thought away as foolish. She was a stranger, passing through, and once the pass cleared she would go back to her town and her shop and her locks, and he would go back to his mountain and his solitude, and that would be the whole of it. But even as he told himself this, some part of him did not quite believe it, and he found himself hoping, in some quiet corner of his heart he had not visited in a long while, that the storm outside would take its time in passing. Louisa woke sometime past midnight to the crackle of the fire and the strange disorientation of a ceiling she did not recognize above her. For a moment panic gripped her, the confusion of waking somewhere unfamiliar, but then the events of the day came rushing back, the storm, the gate, the cold that had seemed to reach all the way into her bones and freeze the very marrow, and the big man who had appeared out of nowhere and carried her out of it. She turned her head and found him seated in a rough wooden chair a few feet from the hearth, not asleep as she had expected, but watching the fire with the kind of stillness that spoke of a man used to long silences, used to his own company. In the firelight she could see him properly for the first time, and she found herself taking stock the way her trade had trained her to take stock of anything, cataloging details, understanding mechanisms. He was, she thought, the largest man she had ever seen up close, with shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of his flannel shirt, and forearms exposed where he had rolled his sleeves that were corded with muscle in a way that told of real labor, not the soft strength of a man who worked behind a desk. His hair had grown long and dark, brushing his collar, and a beard covered his jaw, but none of it hid the fact that his face, what she could see of it, had a kind of rugged honesty to it, weathered by sun and wind but not unkind. "You are awake," he said without turning from the fire, and she wondered how he had known, whether he possessed some sense beyond ordinary hearing, or whether he had simply been listening for the change in her breathing this whole time. "I am," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "How long was I asleep?" Few hours, he said, finally turning to look at her, and in the firelight his eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, like the color of the sky just before a storm breaks. How do you feel? She considered the question honestly. Her body ached in places she had not known could ache, and her fingers and toes still carried a phantom cold that she suspected would take days to fully leave her. But the deep, dangerous chill that had claimed her out at the gate had receded, pushed back by the fire and the blankets, and she suspected, though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, by the warmth of his hands holding hers. Better, she said. Sore, grateful, she paused. You said your name was Daniel Wells. That is right. And this is your land. Homesteaded it near 10 years back, he said. Just me out here. Nearest neighbor is the Callaway spread, 6 miles the other direction from town. I have never had cause to come this way before, Louisa admitted. The Callaways sent word their strongbox jammed, and with the bank examiner due through next week they needed it fixed before he arrived, on account of some paperwork they keep locked inside it. I should have waited for better weather. I knew the sky did not look right when I set out, but I did not want to disappoint a customer. Near cost you your life instead, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice, not quite scolding, more like genuine concern, that made her look at him a little more carefully. I am aware, she said, quieter now. I will be more careful going forward, assuming I get the chance to. You will get the chance, Daniel said firmly. Storm will break in a few days' time, same as they always do this time of year. Until then you are welcome to stay here, and I will see you get back to town safe once the pass clears. Louisa studied him, this stranger who had saved her life and now offered his home without any apparent expectation of payment or favor in return, and she found herself both grateful and, if she was honest, a little wary. She had learned in her 26 years that men rarely offered kindness without eventually wanting something for it, and she had built her life and her business on the principle of trusting her own hands and her own judgment above all else. I can pay you for your trouble, she offered, once I am back in town and have access to my funds. Daniel's expression shifted, something like offense flickering across his features before he schooled it away. I did not pull you off that gate expecting payment, Miss Thatcher. Where I come from, a person helps another person because it is the right thing to do, not because there is coin waiting at the end of it. I did not mean to insult you, she said quickly. I only meant to express my gratitude in a practical way. Your gratitude is expressed plenty already, in you being alive to give it, Daniel said, and there was a gentleness under the gruffness of his words that softened whatever sting her offer might have carried. Now are you hungry? I have got broth warming and some bread I baked 2 days back, though it has gone a bit hard by now. I could eat, Louisa admitted, and as if in answer her stomach growled audibly, and for the first time since she had woken in that strange cabin, she found herself almost smiling. Daniel rose and moved to the small kitchen area, and Louisa watched him work, noting the economy of his movements. A man who had clearly spent years learning to do for himself in a place where there was no one else to do for him. She found herself curious about that solitude, about what had brought a man like this, clearly capable, clearly not unpleasant to look at despite the roughness of his current appearance, to live so entirely alone in the mountains. Do you not get lonely? She asked, before she quite thought better of asking something so personal, living all the way out here by yourself. Daniel's hands stilled for just a moment over the pot he was stirring and then resumed their motion. I did for a time, he said. Used to be I had family out here with me. My brother and his wife homesteaded the land right alongside mine before the winter of '81 took them both, fever that came through and would not let go. After that it was just me. I got used to the quiet, told myself I preferred it. I am sorry, Louisa said softly, for your loss. It was a long time ago now, Daniel said, though something in his voice suggested the wound, while old, had never entirely closed. I do the work of the place, tend my animals, do smithing for anyone in town who needs it done and does not mind riding out this far or waiting for me to ride in. It is enough to keep a man occupied. You are a blacksmith as well? Louisa asked, surprise coloring her voice. Learned it from my father, Daniel said. Never made much of a trade of it out here, on account of there is not enough folks nearby to keep a smithy busy full time. But I keep my forge going for my own needs, shoe my horse, mend my tools, that sort of thing. Louisa felt something shift in her chest at this information, a kind of recognition, the sense of finding common ground with a stranger in the most unexpected of circumstances. I run a locksmith shop in Bannock's Ridge, she said. Though I do some general ironwork too, when a customer needs a hinge mended or a latch replaced. My father was a locksmith back in St. Louis, taught me the trade before he passed, God rest him. I came west 3 years back after he died to make a new start of things somewhere nobody knew me as anything but capable. Not many women take up smithing, Daniel observed, though there was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. Not many women get the chance to, Louisa said, a note of old frustration creeping into her voice. I fought for every bit of respect I have got in that town. There were men who would not bring me their business at first, thought a woman could not possibly understand the mechanisms well enough to be trusted with their locks and their strongboxes. Took me near 2 years to prove myself, one satisfied customer at a time, before folks stopped looking at me sideways when I walked into a room with my tool satchel. Seems to me, Daniel said, ladling broth into a wooden bowl, that anybody who could survive what you survived tonight and still have the presence of mind to worry about a bank examiner's paperwork is not a person easily discouraged. Louisa laughed, a small surprised sound, the first real laugh she had allowed herself since the storm had caught her on the pass. No, she agreed. I suppose I am not. He brought the bowl to her, along with a heel of bread, and helped her sit up enough to eat, propping the blankets behind her back so she would not have to strain. The broth was simple, some kind of dried venison and root vegetables, but it tasted better to her in that moment than any meal she could remember, warmth spreading through her chest and stomach as she ate, and she found herself glancing up at Daniel between spoonfuls, watching him watch her eat with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though her simply being alive and hungry was reward enough for whatever trouble she had caused him. "Thank you," she said again, when the bowl was empty. "Truly. I do not know what would have become of me if you had not found me." "Do not think on that," Daniel said. "What matters is I did find you, and now you are here, and you are safe, and come morning we will figure out the rest of it." She settled back into the blankets, and though her mind was full of questions still about him, about herself, about the strange turn her simple errand had taken, exhaustion pulled at her limbs, and within minutes she had drifted back into sleep, this time deep and untroubled, while Daniel Wells sat in his chair by the fire and watched over her through the long remainder of that howling night, feeling something stir in his chest that he had not felt in the better part of 6 years. Something he was not yet ready to name, but that felt unmistakably like the beginning of hope. Morning came gray and still snowing, though the wind had eased somewhat from the violent gusts of the night before. Louisa woke to find herself alone in the main room, the fire built up high again, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She sat up slowly, testing her body, and found that while she still ached, the deep cold that had gripped her the day before had fully receded, leaving only ordinary soreness in its wake. She pushed the blankets back and discovered someone, presumably Daniel, had left a pair of thick wool socks folded neatly beside her, along with a shirt that was clearly his own, oversized on her frame but warm and dry, a considerable improvement over her own frozen and now thawing dress, which she saw had been hung near the fire to dry, along with her coat and boots. She dressed quickly in the borrowed shirt, rolling the sleeves several times to free her hands, and had just finished when the cabin door opened and Daniel stepped in, stamping snow from his boots, carrying an armload of firewood that he deposited near the hearth with a clatter. "You are up," he said, and something in his expression, a kind of relief mixed with pleasure, told her he had been checking on her more than once through the night, uncertain even after her recovery whether she would wake whole and well. "I am," she confirmed, "and I feel considerably more human than I did last evening. Thank you for the clothes." "Your dress was soaked clean through," Daniel said. "Would have taken all day to dry properly with you still in it. Figured you would not mind borrowing something of mine in the meanwhile." "Not at all," Louisa said, glancing down at herself. "Though I imagine I look a fair sight, swimming in a shirt built for a man twice my size." Daniel's mouth curved into something almost like a smile beneath his beard. "You look fine," he said, and then seemed to catch himself, clearing his throat and turning to busy himself with the bacon still cooking over the smaller fire. They ate breakfast together at his small wooden table, the first proper meal Louisa had shared with another person in longer than she cared to admit. Since coming west, she had eaten most of her meals alone in the back room of her shop, or at the boarding house where she rented a room, surrounded by other boarders but rarely engaged in real conversation. There was something easy about sitting across from Daniel Wells, she found, something that put her at ease despite the strangeness of the circumstances. And by the time the meal was finished, she had told him more about her life than she had told most people she had known for years. She told him about her father, Thomas Thatcher, and his shop in St. Louis, about how she had learned the trade at his side from the time she was old enough to hold a file, how the neighborhood boys had mocked her for it until she grew skilled enough that they came begging her to fix their broken bicycle locks and forgotten combination boxes. She told him about her father's death, a fever much like the one that had taken Daniel's brother, and about the decision that had followed to sell the shop and take the money west, to find a town that needed a locksmith badly enough to overlook the fact that the locksmith in question wore skirts. Bannock's Ridge was desperate enough, she said, with a wry twist to her mouth. Old Prout, who used to do the ironwork in town, had passed on the year before I arrived, and nobody else had taken up the trade proper. I walked in with my tools and my father's letters of reference, and the mayor himself, Mr. Halloran, decided to give me a trial run fixing the jail's lock after the previous key had gone missing. Once I proved I could do it and do it well, the rest of the town came around, slower for some than others. "And now?" Daniel asked. "Business is good." "Good enough," Louisa said. "I have got a shop of my own on Main Street between the Mercantile and the doctor's office. I am not wealthy, but I am independent, and that matters more to me than wealth ever could." Daniel nodded slowly, and Louisa saw something in his expression that looked like respect, genuine and unforced, a rare enough thing in her experience that she found herself unexpectedly moved by it. "What about you?" she said, turning the conversation. 10 years alone out here. Did you never think of finding a wife, starting a family of your own?" Something shadowed passed over Daniel's face, and for a moment Louisa thought she had overstepped, pressed too far into territory he was not willing to share. But then he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "There was a woman," he said, "back before my brother passed. Name was Sarah. We were to be married come the spring after next. But she took sick with the same fever that took my brother and his wife, and she did not survive it either." He paused, staring down at his coffee cup. "After that I did not have much heart left for courting, told myself the mountain was enough, told myself I did not need anybody else to make my life whole." "I am sorry," Louisa said, echoing her words from the night before, but meaning them more deeply now, understanding better the shape of the loneliness that had carved itself into this man's life. "That is a great deal of loss for one person to carry." "It was," Daniel agreed. "But a person learns to carry what they must." He looked up at her then, and something in his gray-blue eyes made her breath catch slightly. "I had near given up thinking anybody else would come along worth changing my mind about the mountain being enough. And then I find you half froze at my gate, going on about bank examiners and locks even as the cold near killed you." A small, genuine smile broke through his beard. "Persistent kind of woman, Miss Thatcher." "I have been called worse," Louisa said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire, and she found herself smiling back at him, a real smile, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be around men she had known less than a day. The storm kept them confined to the cabin for 3 more days, and in that time something began to grow between them that neither had expected nor, once it took root, particularly wanted to stop. Daniel showed her his forge on the second day, once she was steady enough on her feet to venture out to the small smithy attached to his barn, and Louisa found herself entranced by the setup, simple but well-maintained, the same kind of forge her father had kept, though larger, built for a man's heavier work. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the bellows, and when Daniel nodded, curious, she demonstrated for him the particular rhythm her father had taught her, coaxing the coals to a brighter heat with an efficiency that made Daniel's eyebrows lift in surprise. "You know your way around a forge," he observed. "My father made sure of it," Louisa said. Said a locksmith who understood metal at its most basic, molten and malleable, would always understand it better in its finished forms too. He was not wrong. Half of what I know about picking apart a stubborn lock, I learned from watching how metal moves and settles when it is worked. Daniel watched her work the bellows a while longer, and then, almost shyly for a man his size, he asked if she might show him a trick or two of her trade, curious about the mechanisms of the padlocks he kept on his tool shed and smokehouse, simple things he had never had cause to think much about. She spent the better part of an hour that afternoon teaching him the basics of what made a lock resist or yield, using one of his own old locks as demonstration, walking him through the tumblers and springs with the patient enthusiasm of someone sharing a passion rather than simply a trade. Daniel found himself watching her hands more than the lock itself, the sure, deft way she manipulated the tiny tools of her craft, and he thought, not for the first time in those snowbound days, that he had never met a woman quite like Louisa Thatcher, and did not expect to again. That evening, as the fire burned low and the wind outside had finally begun to still, signaling the storm's approaching end, Daniel found himself telling Louisa about his brother in a way he had not spoken of him to anyone since the burial. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about the two of them coming west together as young men chasing the promise of land, about the cabin they had built with their own hands, half of it his and half his brother's, joined by a single wall that Daniel had never had the heart to take down even after there was no longer anyone on the other side of it. "I still go in there sometimes," he admitted, nodding toward a door on the far side of the room that Louisa had noticed but not asked about. "Their old room. I do not rightly know why. Nothing left in there but empty furniture and dust, but it feels wrong somehow to seal it off complete, like closing a door on the fact they ever existed at all." Louisa reached across the small space between them and laid her hand over his, an instinctive gesture of comfort that surprised her even as she made it. "Grief does not follow sensible rules," she said. "I still have my father's old apron hanging in my shop, worn through at the pocket, not fit for use anymore. I could not bring myself to throw it away either. Some things we keep because letting go feels like losing them twice." Daniel turned his hand beneath hers, so that instead of her hand resting atop his, their fingers laced together, and neither of them moved to separate the touch. "You understand," he said quietly, and it was not quite a question. "I understand," Louisa confirmed, and in the firelight, with the wind finally dying down outside and the whole world reduced to the small, warm circle of that cabin, something passed between them that felt like more than simple understanding, felt like the first true foundation of something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of a mountain storm. They sat that way for a long while, hands joined, saying little, until eventually Louisa's eyes grew heavy and she found herself leaning, almost without deciding to, against Daniel's broad shoulder, and he in turn shifted so that his arm came around her, careful and protective, and neither of them spoke of what it meant, not yet. But both of them felt the shift in the air between them, the way something had changed and could not now be changed back. The storm broke fully on the fourth morning, the sky clearing to a hard, bright blue, the kind that came after mountain storms and made the whole world look freshly made. Daniel woke before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to assess the pass, and found it, while still deep with fresh snow, passable enough for a careful rider to make the journey back to town. He stood there for a long moment in the cold morning air, looking out at the mountains he had called home for a decade, and felt something in his chest that he had not expected to feel again, a reluctance, a real and aching reluctance, at the thought of Louisa Thatcher leaving his cabin and riding back down to Bannock's Ridge, back to her shop and her life, and out of the daily orbit of his own. He had not intended to feel this way. He had told himself that first night that he would help her because helping her was right, and that once the storm passed he would see her safely home, and that would be the whole of their acquaintance. A strange story to tell in years to come, the locksmith he found frozen at his gate. But 4 days in close quarters, 4 days of conversation and shared meals, and the particular intimacy of watching someone recover their strength beneath your own roof, had changed something fundamental in him, and he did not know quite what to do with the change. When he went back inside, Louisa was awake, dressed once more in her own clothes, dried now and mended in places where the storm had torn them, her satchel of tools packed and ready by the door. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression told him she had been dreading this moment nearly as much as he had. "The pass is clear enough," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I heard the wind die down in the night," Louisa said. "I suspected as much." She hesitated. "I should get back. The Callaways will be wondering after their strongbox, and my shop has surely accumulated business in my absence." "Of course," Daniel said, though everything in him wanted to say otherwise, wanted to find some reason, any reason, to keep the storm going a while longer. They ate a quiet breakfast together, and then Daniel saddled Samson, the only horse he kept, and helped Louisa up behind him for the ride back to town, her own mare having wandered off during the storm and not yet found, though Daniel promised to search for the animal and return it to her if it turned up on his land. The ride to Bannock's Ridge took the better part of 2 hours, through snow-heavy trails that required Samson to pick his way with care, and Louisa's arms around Daniel's waist for balance became, over the course of that ride, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge as more than practical necessity, though both felt the warmth of the contact settle into something deeper than mere practicality. They talked little on the ride, the cold and the concentration required for the trail leaving small room for conversation. But as the town came into view, the modest cluster of buildings that made up Bannock's Ridge nestled in a valley below the mountain's shoulder, Louisa felt a strange heaviness settle over her, a reluctance to see the ride end that she could not quite explain to herself. "There," she said, pointing toward a modest storefront near the center of town, a sign reading Thatcher's Locks and ironwork hanging above the door. "That is my shop." Daniel guided Samson down the main street, drawing curious glances from townsfolk who recognized neither the rider nor his passenger at first glance, and when he finally drew the horse to a stop before Louisa's shop, he dismounted and helped her down with a care that made her chest tighten with something she did not yet have a name for. "Thank you," she said again, for what felt like the 100th time in 4 days, "for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." "I told you already," Daniel said. "You owe me nothing." They stood there a moment, the awkward space of goodbye stretching between them, neither quite willing to be the one to end it, until finally Louisa spoke again, her voice careful, testing. "Perhaps," she said, "if you ever find yourself in town needing something mended or a lock replaced, you might stop by. I would not mind the company." Daniel felt something ease in his chest at her words, a permission he had not known he was waiting for. "I might do that," he said. "In fact, I believe my smokehouse padlock has been giving me trouble for some time now. Might need a professional's opinion." "I happen to know a very good locksmith," Louisa said, a smile tugging at her lips despite the cold and the fatigue of the journey. "Reasonable rates for a friend." "A friend," Daniel repeated, testing the word, finding it both true and somehow insufficient for what had grown between them in that snowbound cabin. "For now," Louisa said, softer, and something in the way she said it told him she felt the insufficiency too. He watched her disappear into her shop, and then turned Samson back toward the mountain trail. But the ride home felt longer and colder without her presence at his back, and he found himself already counting the days until he might have reasonable cause to return to town. It did not take long. 3 days after delivering Louisa safely to her shop, Daniel rode back into Bannock's Ridge with the offending padlock in his saddlebag, and found an excuse to linger in her shop for the better part of an hour while she worked, watching her hands move with practiced skill over the mechanism, asking questions about her trade that he already half knew the answers to just for the pleasure of hearing her explain them. "There," Louisa said, finally, handing the repaired lock back to him. "Good as new. Better, actually. Whoever installed that mechanism originally did a lazy job of it." "I will let my late father know you said so," Daniel said dryly, "next time I visit his grave." Louisa's eyes widened, momentarily horrified before she caught the twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth, and she swatted his arm, laughing despite herself. "You are terrible," she said, "making a woman feel guilty over a perfectly accurate professional assessment." "My father would have agreed with you, most likely," Daniel said, still smiling. He was not a patient man with poor craftsmanship, in his own work or anybody else's. They talked a while longer about nothing of particular importance, the kind of easy conversation that fills the space between two people who enjoy simply being in each other's company. And when Daniel finally made to leave, reluctant though he was to do so, Louisa surprised them both by asking if he might stay for supper. "I do not have much on hand," she admitted, "but I make a decent stew, and it has been some time since I had proper company for a meal." Daniel stayed, and the stew was indeed decent, and the conversation over it stretched long into the evening, until finally Daniel realized the hour had grown late enough that he would be riding back to his cabin in full darkness, and he took his leave with a reluctance that had become, in the space of that single visit, a familiar and not entirely unwelcome ache. Over the following weeks, through the remainder of that hard winter, Daniel found more and more reasons to make the ride into Bannock's Ridge, and Louisa found herself watching for him, some part of her attuned now to the particular sound of Samson's hooves on the frozen street outside her shop, a sound that never failed to send a small thrill of anticipation through her chest. They fell into an easy rhythm of visits and shared meals and long conversations that ranged from the practical to the deeply personal, and slowly, carefully, like two people building something they both understood to be fragile and precious, they built a friendship that neither of them could quite deny had grown into something more. It was on an evening in early March, when the worst of the winter had begun to loosen its grip, and the first hints of the coming spring could be felt in the lengthening days, that Daniel finally worked up the nerve to say what had been building in him since that first night by the fire. He had ridden into town under the pretense of delivering a batch of horseshoes he had forged for the local livery, but once the delivery was made, he found his feet carrying him, as they so often did now, to Louisa's shop, where he found her closing up for the evening, locking the front door with practiced efficiency before turning to find him standing there. "Daniel," she said, surprise and pleasure mingling in her voice, "I did not expect you today." "I did not expect myself either," he admitted. "But I found I had something I needed to say, and could not wait any longer to say it." Something in his tone made Louisa's breath catch, and she set down her key ring, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" Daniel took a breath, gathering the courage that had eluded him for weeks now, courage that had faced down mountain storms and years of solitary grief, but somehow found this moment, this simple confession, more daunting than either. "Louisa," he said, "I have been telling myself for 2 months now that what I feel for you is friendship, and gratitude for the chance to have someone to talk to after all these years alone. But I do not believe that is the whole truth anymore, and I think you know it too." Louisa's heart was pounding now, and she found she could not look away from him, from the earnest vulnerability in his gray-blue eyes. "Daniel," she started, but he pressed on, needing to finish now that he had begun. "I think about you all the time," he said. "I ride into town with excuses that grow thinner every visit because the truth is I do not need excuses. I only need to see you. I have not felt this way about anybody since Sarah, and I did not think I would feel this way again, did not think I wanted to. But you walked into my life, or I suppose you froze at my gate and I carried you into it, and everything has felt different since. Better. Fuller." He paused, searching her face for some sign of how she was receiving this. "I am not a man of many words, Louisa Thatcher, but I am asking you plain. Do you feel it too, this thing between us?" Louisa felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, and she stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes properly, given how he towered over her. "I have felt it since that first night," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Since you held my hands by the fire and would not let go until you were certain I would be all right. I told myself it was only gratitude too at first. But gratitude does not make a woman watch for a particular sound of hooves on the street every single day. Gratitude does not make her heart race the way mine does every time you walk through that door." Daniel's hands came up, cupping her face with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible given their size and strength, and Louisa leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a moment at the warmth and tenderness of it. "May I kiss you?" he asked quietly, and Louisa answered by rising up on her toes and closing the last small distance between them herself. The kiss was soft at first, careful, two people testing the shape of something new and precious, but it deepened as neither of them pulled away, as the weeks of building affection finally found their release, and when they finally parted, both were breathless, both were smiling in a way that felt like the sun breaking through the long winter clouds. "I believe," Louisa said, laughing softly, "that we have been very foolish, both of us, dancing around this for so long." "I believe you are right," Daniel agreed, and kissed her again briefly, unable to help himself. "Though I do not regret the dancing exactly. I got to know you slow and proper, and I would not trade that for anything, even if it took us longer to arrive here than it might have otherwise." They stood there in the fading evening light outside her shop, wrapped in each other's arms, and Louisa thought with a clarity that surprised her that whatever had brought her to that broken gate in the middle of a mountain storm, however terrifying the circumstance had been, she would not undo a single moment of it now, not if it meant losing losing him. Their courtship, once acknowledged, moved with the particular swiftness of two people who had already spent months building the foundation of real friendship and understanding before ever admitting to deeper feelings. Daniel began riding into town not once a week but several times, and when the spring thaw fully arrived and the passes cleared entirely, Louisa began riding out to his homestead as well, on a mare she had finally located and purchased to replace the one lost in the storm, spending long afternoons at his forge or walking his land, learning the shape of his life as thoroughly as he had learned the shape of hers. The town of Bannock's Ridge, as small frontier towns tend to do, took notice of the courtship quickly, and while there were a few who raised eyebrows at the notion of the town's independent lady locksmith courting a mountain man who kept mostly to himself, most of the townsfolk seemed genuinely pleased by the match, having grown fond of Louisa's competent, no-nonsense presence in their community over her 3 years there, and having always harbored a quiet respect and sympathy for Daniel Wells, the young man who had lost his brother and his intended in one terrible winter and retreated to his mountain to grieve alone. Mrs. Halloran, the mayor's wife, took it upon herself to spread the news with particular enthusiasm, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had always known Louisa Thatcher needed a good strong man to match her stubborn independence, and that Daniel Wells, having proven himself capable of both saving a woman's life and courting her properly afterward, was exactly the sort of man the town could be proud to welcome more fully into its fold. By early summer, when the mountain wildflowers had begun their brief, brilliant bloom across the high meadows, Daniel decided the time had come to make his intentions permanent, and he spent the better part of a week at his forge, working after his usual chores were done, shaping and reshaping a small band of gold he had purchased from the assay office in town, determined to craft the ring himself rather than simply buy one ready-made, wanting Louisa to have something touched by his own hands. Made with the same care he had first shown her that night by the fire. He rode to town on a Sunday evening in June, when he knew Louisa would have closed her shop for the day, and found her sitting on the small porch outside her rented room above the shop, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. She smiled when she saw him approaching, that particular smile that had come to feel, over these past months, like the most welcoming sight in his entire world. "Daniel," she said, rising to meet him, "I did not expect you this evening." "I found I had something I needed to ask you," he said, echoing without quite meaning to, the same words he had used the evening he first confessed his feelings, and something in Louisa's expression told him she remembered the parallel too. He took her hands in his, the same hands he had once warmed by his fire when they had been nearly frozen through, and he sank down onto one knee on the wooden porch, ignoring the small gasp that escaped her as understanding dawned. "Louisa Thatcher," he said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart, "I have loved you since near the moment I carried you through my door, though it took me some weeks to admit it even to myself. You have brought light back into a life I had convinced myself needed no more light than what a fire could provide. I do not want to spend another winter without you beside me, and I do not want to spend any season after that without you either. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, and let me spend the rest of my days making sure you are never cold, never frightened, never alone again?" He held up the ring, simple but well-made, the gold catching the last light of the sunset, and Louisa, tears streaming freely down her face now, nodded before she could even find the words to answer properly. "Yes," she said when her voice finally cooperated. "Yes, Daniel Wells, 1,000 times yes. I love you. I have loved you since you held my hands by that fire and refused to let go until you were certain I would live. I do not want to imagine a life without you in it, not for one more day." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, having taken careful measurements during one of her visits under the pretense of admiring her hands while she worked at her tools, and then he rose and gathered her into his arms, kissing her deeply as the last light of the sunset gave way to the soft blue of evening, while the whole town, or at least the parts of it near enough to witness the scene from their own porches and windows, watched with quiet approval and no small amount of romantic satisfaction. They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony held in the small church at the edge of Bannock's Ridge, with the whole town in attendance, having taken the courtship to their hearts as thoroughly as they had taken each of the 2 participants individually over the preceding years. Mrs. Halloran had insisted on helping Louisa with her dress, a simple but elegant thing made from fabric ordered specially from Helena, and the mayor himself had offered to walk Louisa down the aisle, given that she had no family of her own remaining in the world, a gesture that had moved Louisa to tears of gratitude for the community that had, in the end, embraced her so fully. Daniel stood at the front of the church in a suit he had not worn since his brother's funeral, feeling the weight of the occasion and the joy of it in equal measure, and when Louisa appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in her simple gown, he felt his heart so full he could scarcely breathe. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the pastor speaking of love found in unexpected circumstances, of storms that brought people together rather than driving them apart, and when the vows were exchanged, and the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in cheers and applause that Daniel felt certain could be heard clear up in the mountains where his solitary life had once seemed, to him, sufficient. They held the wedding celebration in the town square, with tables set up laden with food contributed by nearly every family in Bannock's Ridge, and music provided by a local fiddle player who had learned the trade from his own father decades before. Daniel danced with his new wife beneath the summer evening sky, clumsy at first, having little occasion for dancing in his years of solitude, but growing more confident with each turn as Louisa laughed and guided him through the steps. And he thought, watching her face lit with joy and firelight from the bonfire someone had lit at the edge of the square, that he had never in his life felt so completely, unreservedly happy. They settled into married life at Daniel's homestead, though within the first year they made improvements to accommodate both their lives fully, expanding the cabin with a proper second room where Louisa could keep a small workshop of her own for the occasions when customers needed work done that could not wait for her to ride into town, and reinforcing the old fence line entirely, replacing every broken gate and rusted hinge with new iron work that Louisa forged herself, laughing as she did it that she was symbolically ensuring no other storm-caught traveler would ever again find themselves trapped the way she once had. Louisa maintained her shop in town as well, riding in several days a week to tend to her regular customers, her reputation as the finest locksmith in the territory having only grown over the years, while Daniel continued his own work on the homestead, though he found himself taking on more smithing commissions now that he had a partner to share the workload, and more importantly, a reason to want the additional income. Dreams of the future pulling him toward ambitions he had set aside during his years of solitary grief. The old room that had belonged to his brother and Sarah, the room Daniel had never been able to bring himself to clear out entirely, finally found new purpose in the second year of their marriage, when Louisa, several months along with their first child, suggested gently that perhaps it was time to let that space become something new, a nursery rather than a shrine to old sorrow, while still honoring the memory of those who had been lost by keeping a small shelf with photographs and mementos of his brother and Sarah, a way of remembering without being consumed by the remembering. Daniel had wept quietly the day they finished converting the room, not from sorrow but from a profound sense of healing, of a wound that had finally, after so many years, begun to close over properly, leaving a scar rather than an open sore, and he had held Louisa close that evening, his hand resting against the growing swell of her belly, and thanked whatever Providence had seen fit to send a locksmith wandering onto his land in the middle of a mountain storm. Their first child, a son, was born the following spring, during a night considerably calmer than the storm that had first brought his parents together, though Daniel found himself pacing the length of the cabin with much the same nervous energy he had felt watching over Louisa during her recovery years before. They named him Thomas, after Louisa's father, and Daniel held his son for the first time with hands that had once been rough enough to work iron and gentle enough to warm a stranger's frozen fingers, and found them equally capable now of cradling new life with a tenderness that surprised even himself. 2 years after Thomas's birth, a daughter followed, whom they named Sarah, in honor of the woman Daniel had once loved and lost, a decision Louisa herself had suggested, understanding without needing lengthy explanation that some kinds of love deserved to be remembered and honored even as new love flourished alongside the memory of it. Daniel had been deeply moved by the gesture, recognizing in it the particular generosity of spirit that had drawn him to Louisa from the very first, a woman capable of holding compassion for the dead alongside fierce devotion to the living. Their homestead prospered over the following years, Daniel's smithing business growing steadily as the territory itself grew, more settlers arriving each year as word spread of good land and opportunity in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, and Louisa's reputation as a skilled locksmith spreading far enough that she occasionally received requests from towns 2 and 3 days' ride away, work she took on selectively, unwilling to be away from her family for too long at a stretch. They added to their family once more, a second son they named Daniel, after his father, born during a mild winter that stood in sharp contrast to the brutal storm that had first brought his parents together, And by the time young Daniel had learned to walk, the Wells homestead had grown into a proper thriving establishment, with a larger barn, a well-stocked smithy that Daniel and, increasingly, young Thomas worked together, and fields that Louisa herself often tended alongside the hired hand they had eventually taken on as the work grew beyond what the family alone could manage. The broken gate that had once nearly cost Louisa her life remained a subject of gentle family legend, retold each year on the anniversary of that fateful storm, a story their children grew up hearing with the particular fondness children reserve for the tales of how their parents came to find each other. Thomas, in particular, took to asking for the story often, delighting in the drama of it, the storm and the frozen gate and his father's desperate race through the snow, and Louisa would tell it each time with the same warmth and gratitude she had felt in the moment itself, grateful beyond measure that fate, or providence, or simple chance, had guided her to that particular gate on that particular land, rather than any other point along the vast, unforgiving mountain trail. Daniel, for his part, kept the original broken gate, the very one Louisa had collapsed against, mended but preserved rather than fully replaced, a small monument at the edge of their property to the night everything in his life had changed for the better. He had reinforced it properly, of course, ensuring it would never again trap or fail anyone who needed to pass through it, but he could not bring himself to tear it down entirely and replace it with something unremarkable, not when it represented the exact spot where his solitary existence had ended and his true life, the one he had not even known he was missing, had properly begun. On the 10th anniversary of that storm, with their 3 children grown enough to understand the full weight of the story, Daniel took Louisa back out to that gate on a cold January evening much like the one that had first brought them together, though this time the sky was clear and full of stars rather than choked with snow, and he took her hands in his, the same way he had done that first night, though now for entirely different reasons. "Do you remember," he asked, "what I told you that first night, holding your hands by the fire?" "You told me to hang on," Louisa said, smiling at the memory, the cold sharp but not dangerous around them now, nothing like the deadly bite of that original storm. "Told me the fire would push the cold back out of me." "I have thought about that a great deal over these years," Daniel said. "How strange it is that a person's whole life can turn on one small kindness, one decision to go out into a storm instead of staying safe inside. If I had not heard you call out, if the wind had carried the sound the other direction, I might still be alone out here, might never have known what I was missing." "But you did hear me," Louisa said, "and you did come, and here we are, 10 years and 3 children later, still standing at this same gate." "Still standing at this gate," Daniel agreed, "and I intend to keep standing here with you for every year we have left, however many that turns out to be. I love you, Louisa Wells. I loved you the moment I saw you were still breathing that first night, and I have loved you more with every year that has passed since." "I love you too," Louisa said, rising up to kiss him despite the cold, despite the 10 years of marriage that had done nothing to diminish the particular thrill she still felt every time his lips met hers. "And I am endlessly grateful, every single day, that this gate happened to be broken on the exact night I needed it to be, so that fate could not help but bring us together." They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand, toward the warm glow of the windows where their 3 children waited, toward the forge that had first drawn Louisa's professional curiosity and later come to symbolize the warmth and safety Daniel had offered her from that very first night, toward a life that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something neither of them could have imagined possible in their years of separate solitude and loss. The mountain wind still howled sometimes, in the depths of winter, rattling the shutters and testing the strength of the reinforced fence line, but inside the Wells homestead, the fire always burned bright and steady, tended by 2 people who had learned, through hardship and unlikely rescue, exactly what it meant to keep each other warm through every storm life might yet bring their way, and who intended to spend every remaining year of their lives proving that particular lesson true together. Always together, for as long as they both should live. Years later, when their children had grown and some had homesteads of their own scattered across the valley, Daniel and Louisa would still walk out to that same mended gate on quiet evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had first brought them together, and they never once forgot, not for a single day of their long and happy marriage, the miracle of that terrible storm and the fire that had saved them both.